Okay, I think we will get started just to try to keep on time today. So welcome everybody. I'm so excited to see so many folks joining us today. My name is Lane Wilson. I am the co-chair of the Graduate Student Network along with Nicole Crozier. Before we get started today, I just want to acknowledge that I'm grateful and appreciative that we're all logging in today as presenters and participants from traditional territories of Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. Today we have 6 wonderful individuals here to share their graduate work, and I just wanted to extend my thanks to Mark Mariner, Noah Arney, Marina Spalla, Dan Cantiller, Logan Lorenz, and Nicole Crozier for sharing with us today. I've had the opportunity to connect with many of you throughout our grad school journeys, and I'm just really looking forward to learning from each of you. So today, each presentation will be approximately 10 minutes. We'll have a 5-minute break midway through. And if anyone has any questions for the presenters, we'll have a few minutes between each presentation. So feel free to ask those questions using the chat function. We do ask that you remain muted throughout the presentations, but if you do have questions in between, you can unmute at that time to ask. So I think that's all from me. So I think to start things off, we have Mark Mariner, and he is presenting on the Assumed Supervisor, a gap in supervision training for entry-level student affairs professionals. Turn it over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Lane. I will try and share my screen here and make sure this works before we get going. Are people able to see the poster? Yep. Okay, great. So hi, everyone. My name is Mark Mariner. I currently work at Western University in London in their Housing and Ancillary Services Division as a residence area manager. I just completed my Master's of Education at Laurier University, and I'm really excited to speak with you today about my research and my capstone project, which was titled The Assumed Supervisor, a Gap in Supervision Training for Student Affairs, Entry-Level Student Affairs Professionals. So in my project, I endeavored to address the gap that exists in supervision training available to entry-level professionals, and really the unintended consequences that a lack of supervision training can have. Many professionals enter into their new roles, often right out of their undergraduate degree, with experience being in a variety of student staff capacities, with really little to no experience supervising people. Upon entering into what's more often than not their first supervisory role, there's an assumption that this transition also brings with it the natural ability to be a good supervisor, which isn't often the case. Supervision is often essential to an institution and is really a critical component in any staffing plan. And recognizing the field has been functioning effectively for the past decade or so with no supervision training in place. For me, to determine the urgency of where I think this problem lies, I really leaned into utilizing an Eisenhower matrix and would classify this as in the decide quadrant. So it's important, but it's not necessarily an urgent problem. For me, the importance of this issue really arises from what we see when an employee does not experience effective supervision. And through the literature, it really shows a significant correlation to high attrition rates in an early professional's career. So attrition rates for new professionals significantly higher than their mid or senior level counterparts, and are reported to really abandon the field at a rate between 39 to as high as 68% within the first 5 years, which is a really significant number. In determining an appropriate solution to this problem, I felt it was really important to think about the scope of the solution and who needed to be consulted along the way. So to understand the solution's need and impact, consulting with current students, entry-level and more senior-level staff would really be beneficial in my eyes. Student staff would be a primary demographic, I think, to ask about their current experience with past and present supervisors, and to understand how their experience, both positive and negative, has impacted their roles. Moving then through to current entry-level professionals would provide really good direct feedback on their lived experience to understand their perspective better. And the value with asking mid and senior level professionals after that is to have them think back on their experience of what would have been useful for them to better understand what they had to figure out along the way versus what we can train someone right from the beginning and some of those critical lessons that had been learned. From there, once a solid understanding of the needed solution is present, I felt other consultations such as external consultants or professional organizations, so things such as caucus, regional associations like OOCUO and things like that, would be required to develop an appropriate proposal for implementing some sort of solution. And some specific considerations such as like budget requirements, interest in the program, a needs assessment of the membership, and specific logistics would also be essential to gather from these groups of consultations as well. Throughout my research, I also felt it was really important to ground my solution in theoretical background to ensure that best practices are being taught and were top of mind. So of the literature focusing on student affairs and higher education, synergistic supervision is one of the most prevalent theories emerging around how to supervise in this field. However, there's still an identifiable gap in research related specifically to this field, and a lot of supervision theory and practice are actually based in counseling and clinical settings right now, which have been adopted into the student affairs field. So there's a lot we can learn from other functional areas and other types of work, but not too much that's specific on student affairs. In order to determine what solutions, if any, are also already being used at different institutions, I performed an environmental scan of different supervision training and professional development opportunities at 6 different Canadian universities. And from that, it was found that it was not uncommon for some institutions to have supervision professional development available to their employees. However, the availability of these resources were specific to those who worked at that institution. So the accessibility of that wasn't very broad. With that information, it then strengthened my idea to have a standardized PD opportunity to which is not based out of one institution, but is actually housed through caucus to allow for greater accessibility to more people within the field. This assessment also kind of led me to accessing demographic data that I actually obtained through speaking with some caucus leadership to better understand the professional development needs and wants of the members within this field. And what I found through that was that there was a real desire for PD to develop the leadership, management, and administrative competency, which would include content around supervision best practice. And when we looked at delivery mode as well, things like online courses, webinars, and hybrid approach models were the most requested mode of delivery at this time. So based on all of this information, my solution entails creating an accredited foundational training workshop that's offered through caucus, which provides theory, practical application, and foundational building blocks needed to be an effective supervisor. And I based my idea on how the how assist works, where it's a multi-day workshop. So this would be a 2-day intensive workshop where formalized and standardized training materials developed through and in consultation with caucus are outsourced to trained facilitators where professionals in the field can register and take the course. The core training workshop would contain different information that the fundamentals, but then it's also opportunity to have different courses or different things that people can take as one-offs that talk about different functional areas. So for example, are you a supervisor of a unionized staff member? Are you a supervisor of volunteer staff, of student staff, et cetera, et cetera. And then this can be accessed on an ongoing basis for continual PD. As the field of student affairs progresses, continual evolution and adaptation of best practice will continue to emerge, all with the common goal of supporting staff and enhancing individual professional development. So it's been showcased that there is a gap in the field regarding supervision training, and that research will need to continue to further understand the benefits of utilizing various supervision frameworks, techniques, and strategies, and then what those long-term effects of these would have on the field. So that was a snapshot of kind of the work that I've done, and I'm hoping to get this kind of actually out into our world.
That was great. Thanks so much, Mark. A lot of content to digest there, but I love the idea of using the framework like from Assist to build something, an intensive program like that. I think that's really awesome. So thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Mark about his research and program? Okay. So next up then we have Noah Arney, and his presentation is entitled Indigenous Student Perceptions of the Holistic Benefits of Work Integrated Learning. Oh, sorry. There is one question I just see in the chat, Noah, if you don't mind. Mark, have you identified more specifically what some of the good building blocks of good supervision would be?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of literature that talks about supervision as a general sense. And when I'm talking about building blocks, I'm thinking about things like performance management, how to be organized as a supervisor, how do you embed tenets of like equity, diversity, and inclusion into your supervision practices, things that provide a foundation to folks that you can then build off of in future trainings or future PD. But that is not solely you watching your supervisor do these things and assuming that they're correct.
Thanks. And then Dan commented, the training is something that may be of interest as a pre-conference for caucus or OACUHO, I don't know which that one is, and maybe New Professionals Training Institute, which I think are really cool ideas. And then we have Dayton Edwards has said, I think it's also worth exploring what this may look like for staff who don't currently belong to an association, which I think is a really great point. Thanks, Dan. The association is for housing officers. I wasn't aware. Okay, so Noah, I think I will now pass it on to you. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, welcome. So good afternoon. I'm Noah Arney, and I am going to skip the PowerPoint today. I had a PowerPoint, and then I was like, you know what? I have talked about this research so many times with the PowerPoint. I'm just going to chat. So a shorter version of the title, because I realized after I sent the title to Lane, I'm like, that's a really long title. So we're going to call this Relational Work Integrated Learning. So learning from Indigenous students. Now, I'm joining you today from the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot peoples. I'm in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta, and so that includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Ehe Nakota. So a little bit about me first. I'm a settler and an immigrant to Canada. So I'm Mennonite and was raised in the Mennonite communities of Winkler, Manitoba, and Abbotsford, British Columbia. For the last 12 years, I've been working with Indigenous communities in Lytton and Vancouver, and most recently in Calgary. So where this started was there was a report that was put out in, I think, very early January 2020. And it was talking about the benefits that work integrated learning gives to students. And so I was looking at that and I thought, oh, that's really neat. So I started looking through it. I'm like, okay, well, what are the benefits pre-graduation? And there was a whole section about how they really had no idea, because all of the data that we have is basically looking at the post-graduation economic benefits. Except that post-graduation economic benefits aren't really the whole point of WIL. They're sort of they're not even the outcome. They're sort of the impact of the outcome of WIL. And so I started looking into it. I'm like, okay, well, let's take a look at the Indigenous student populations included in this, and basically nothing. And so I thought, okay, well, this is a great place to start. So I did some research around it and looked into the data and realized that we literally don't actually have good enough data to make any guesses here. So I thought, okay, well, let's talk to students directly. Let's find out directly from students what's going on. And so that's where this started out. And so the next step from that is I decided, okay, well, let's look not just talking to students one-on-one, but also let's look at students' GPA changes, because that's supposed to be one of the things that we can look at. And so let's see, okay, is there a GPA change? Is the GPA change affecting Indigenous students differently than non-Indigenous students? Are there differences in the number of Indigenous students in WIL programs? And so that's where this came from. So skipping over most of the theoretical background of work integrated learning. Other than that, some of the main benefits seen from it are things like technical and transferable skills, increased confidence, knowledge of the workplace, a stronger understanding of one's identity, access to industry-connected communities of practice, and that generally transfers into improved academic performance and retention. It generally transforms into knowing where you want to go once you've graduated and giving you more drive once you've graduated. And those things tend to lead to better employment outcomes. So the research question from this is, what value do Indigenous students gain from work integrated learning? And do those benefits actually fit into the global work integrated learning framework that a lot of us have been using for the last while? So the specific types of WIL that I was using in the study it was curricular, it was paid, and it was two types. One was the mandatory work experience, which is 4 months of mandatory work experience, and another group was in the optional, and that is a 12-month program. Now, the framing for this, I used Michelle Pidgeon's Indigenous Holistic framework in order to really talk to students from a holistic perspective and to get a holistic understanding of where they saw the benefits of their experience. Now, this was mixed methods, explanatory sequential, so the quantitative portion was based on the GPA of the students before and after WIL and the percentage of Indigenous students in optional WIL versus mandatory WIL. Then the qualitative portion was one-on-one interviews with Indigenous students on their experiences and how they constructed the benefits of that. And then I sort of brought that all together using the quantitative data to provide context for the students' perceptions. So the key findings, so the total number of students was just over 16,000. Everybody's GPA basically increases. So, and again, this is basically moving from year 2 to year 3. So seeing a GPA increase there is always nice. Doesn't always happen, but for students in work integrated learning, all of them get a GPA increase. There's no meaningful difference between the 60 Indigenous students and the 1,600 non-Indigenous students in the sample size. They both have the same increase. The biggest thing that came up in the quantitative was actually in the optional WIL program versus the mandatory. So the mandatory WIL program was about 4% Indigenous students, and the faculties that represented have about 4% Indigenous students. The optional WIL programs, on the other hand, again, have about 4% Indigenous students, and they had 2.67% Indigenous students in the WIL program. So that is a huge problem that came out in this. For the qualitative results, I did interviews with 8 students, and the outcomes of that is that they identified that the best WIL experiences required an authentic experience, that it built their confidence, that they got to collaborate with other people, that they got to have a lot of reflection built into it, and that they were able to develop a relationship with the post-secondary staff. So a lot of this really lined up with the global WIL framework that we use. They also identified the skills that they felt increased the most, and those were the skills of self-management and critical thinking and implementation. So the students identified that the experience was best when it was an authentic experience in collaboration with others that provided a challenging responsibility. And they also almost uniformly said that if it hadn't been paid, they couldn't have done it. So that's where we get back to that the GPA and percentages thing. First of all, the GPA difference really clearly shows that there's no deficit. The problem is not that Indigenous students aren't doing well. The problem is that universities aren't recruiting Indigenous students. And so that brings up the issue. So that also sort of points out, okay, making sure that these are in fact paid opportunities, making sure that these are in fact opportunities that are attracting students, that we are recruiting students. And so that's where a lot of the work is going to need to be done by post-secondaries. The other part was around the authentic experience, the collaboration, and the challenging responsibilities. And a lot of that led to what I have been talking about as relational will, that the important part of the work integrated learning experience, it's not the technical skills. It's not the ability to, it's not job training. It is the development of relationships and learning how to function in a workplace and learning how to build a community and learning how to interact with people and building those relationships that are going to support them in the next few years. So how that looks then is that we need to be focusing work integrated learning on building the relationships between students and employers, between students and supervisors, between students and coworkers, between students and fellow students, between students and post-secondary staff and faculty. That this prepping students for this relationship building is where we need to be focusing, because that is going to be what generates the other outcomes. That is going to be what leads to the other outcomes. And that brings us to what can be a little bit of a problem moving forward. So that problem that is moving forward is that a lot of places are moving towards bringing in virtual will experiences. And that may lack the relationship building component that students identified as being a foundational part of this experience. So work integrated learning is always, of course, done through the experiential learning idea. And so we talk about having the experience and then reflecting on the experience and then implementing that, the outcomes of that reflection. And really having the experience and reflecting on it and implementing it all get built off of that relational component. They all get built off of the community that these students are developing as they go through this. So final outcomes of that are treating participants and the knowledge and skills and background and culture that they bring with respect, ensuring those experiences are relevant, ensuring that learning is reciprocal, that they are not just going there to do a thing, but rather that they are going there to bring their knowledge into that workplace and to learn from that workplace. And finally, to make sure that everybody understands their responsibilities to each other, that that the staff and faculty from the post-secondary side, the employers, and the students all understand that the whole point of this is to develop those relationships, to meet people, to talk to people, and to grow within that workplace in a much more holistic and non-linear way than they would do normally through their normal classwork. Because that's what they'll be bringing back to the classroom. That's what they'll be bringing on with them once they're done their post-secondary. So what are your questions about that, now that we've sort of gone through the research?
So we've got a question from Nicole. Did you identify any of the reasons why a lower percentage of Indigenous students are participating in the non-mandatory co-op or well?
So no, I didn't look into why they weren't participating. So that's going to need to be probably some more research in the future into the why. Those reasons tend to vary by institution from discussions I've had with people at different institutions, which may show that it has a lot to do with how the university supports students in general, Indigenous students, and whether or not they're being supported in being encouraged into these positions in the same way that students who may have parents or relatives who've gone through similar programs are doing.
Thanks. I'm curious, Noah, if you can share any of the examples from students who had really positive experiences with their employer and what made those so positive for them.
Yes. Yeah. So the experiences that were the most positive were where employers treated them as experts in their own field. That they were brought in not as, okay, you are learning for something for the future, but rather the things you already know are important and the skills and abilities that you are bringing are already important. And that sort of treatment. One of the students mentioned that they never felt that way in their academic program, which is a separate problem. But the students really felt that, so that student in particular and several other students said similar things, that being treated as not as a trainee, but as a contributing employee to the workplace was a huge shift for them. This one student in particular was a mature student, and so they had felt really that being treated as a 30-year-old in the same way as somebody who doesn't have life experience in their academic program was a problem for them. And here they felt that that their life experience, both in their academics and in life in general, were really being respected and were really being heard and listened to and implemented. And they were able to use those experiences in all of their aspects of their work. And that really developed their confidence. That really helped them to build their network with other employees and really helped them move forward in that. And that's something that they were able to bring back with them into their academic program. And something that we always talk about in work integrated learning is that when students come back from a work placement, they're driven to complete their program. And part of me wonders if it isn't this experience of in first and second year especially, you're not treated as having a ton of experience that is applicable and meaningful. And then they go into the workplace and they realize, no, what I have is important. What I have is enough. What I have means that I'm not learning for the future, but rather that what I have learned is good right now. And that's a very different perspective. That sort of gets into something that might need to be looked at for a scholarship of teaching and learning. So that's a wildly different topic.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. There's a lot to reflect on, I think, from that and things that I can think of in working with students, that piece of treating them as an expert. That's so important. I really like that. Does anybody else have any questions or comments for Noah today? I'm not seeing any, but I'll give it another minute. Okay, well, thank you so much, Noah. Really appreciate it.
Very welcome.
Okay, so next up we have Marina Spalla, and her presentation is titled Millennials as Leaders, Follower-Centric Leadership in Multigenerational Organizations.
Thank you, Lane. So I am a PowerPoint person, so I will pull that up and we'll get going. It's not a long one, don't worry. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Marina Spalla. I am an enrollment management professional, and I'm also a millennial. The M word has definitely been buzzy over the last few years. Critics have indicated that millennials have ruined so many different parts of our day-to-day life, including the bar, soap, and diamond industries, to name a few. So what happens then when millennials enter into the workforce, and more specifically, what happens when they enter into leadership positions within their organization and might have baby boomer or Gen X subordinates? So how do millennials, who have been dubbed the look at me generation, develop trust amongst their followers in these increasingly multi-generational organizations? This is actually the position that I found myself in. I was put into leadership roles, and I was working with individuals who were the same age as my parents, and I was the same age as their children. And there was a lack of trust between us because they only saw me as their child and I only saw them as my parents. So there was a lot of gaps in our ages, which led to massive differences in terms of the way we experience life in the workforce. So this is where I decided to take my research at the Lang School of Business at the University of Guelph, where I recently completed my MA in leadership. So theorists today really cannot agree on the age groupings of generational cohorts. There's a lot of discussion and arguments about even if these generational cohorts are valid anymore. But for the sake of this presentation and the research that I conducted, baby boomers are said to be born between 1946 to 1964. Generation X are recognized as being born between 1964 and 1981, and millennials are those born between 1982 to the late 1990s. We do have a newer generational cohort that would be soon entering the workforce, which is Generation Z, and they're born between the late 90s and the mid 2000s. I will say that if anyone's offended by their generational categorization, it's not me, it's those many theorists who have come up with these categorizations. So each of these cohorts have experienced life and life events in vastly different ways, and you can see that just from the times that they were born. So many things would have happened in that period of time. So if we look at things like media and technology and how that's shifted over the course of these generations, each grouping has experienced life in a very different way. So baby boomers, they witnessed societal changes for the first time in front of their eyes with the rise of television sets in their homes. Gen Xers continued to see those changes in front of their eyes, but had a little more cynicism and skepticism attached to it, not necessarily taking everything that they saw as what was reality or at face value. Millennials, we were born and raised in a world of limitless boundaries with globalization and the shifts in technology. So borders have shrunk. We're a more digitally savvy cohort. And then our newest generation, Generation Z, are digital natives. They grew up in a time when the internet was obviously super accessible to them, but also accessible from the palm of their hands. So everybody has experienced these shifts really differently, and it goes beyond just media and technology. So there are often quite a few different words or phrases that we attach to particular generational cohorts. Baby boomers, they were born into a world with a healthy economy, job stability, optimism. Gen Xers, were dubbed latchkey kids for the physical key they wore around their neck to let them into their homes after school, as both their parents were often full-time workers outside of the home. Millennials, as I mentioned, they've been dubbed the look at me generation, categorized often as selfish, lazy, overconfident, but then also in the opposite way, they've been described as goal-oriented or really willing to learn. So while these phrases are certainly stereotypes and generalizations, they absolutely influence the way in which millennials lead their team and how other generational cohorts will follow. So how do we combat this? So I argue that follower-centric leadership styles, such as transformational, authentic, and servant leadership, if they're employed by millennials, they can begin to develop trust amongst their teams and lead them to great success. So each of these follower-centric leadership styles relies on fostering trustworthy relationships between leaders and followers. So these styles demand that leaders recognize the needs of their followers and guide them in reaching their full potential. So a quick overview of all three. So transformational is a style of leadership that emphasizes the importance of emotions, values, and ethics of the individuals within an organization. It's a true relationship between the leaders and the followers, where leaders are particularly considerate of the differences amongst their followers and seek to enhance their experience based on their individual and unique needs. Transformational leaders have to call attention to the values of their followers based on their individual experiences, especially to develop trust. Authentic leadership demands that leaders are genuine and real in all their interactions with their followers. It's a theory that's rooted in positive psychology and is built upon self-awareness, transparency, grounded morals, and an understanding of the needs and values of the people within an organization. And then finally, servant leadership is a style of leadership that requires followers to have confidence that their leader has their best interest in heart and will go above and beyond the typical leadership attributes to ensure maximum potential of the followers is achieved. So this leadership style suggests that leaders should go above and beyond their own personal self-interest within their organization to best serve their followers in reaching their own personal and professional goals. So with all of these three leadership styles in mind, how do millennials as leaders utilize these styles to develop trust amongst their followers, particularly those who are from a different generation and have different values and different ways of assessing and developing trust? So there's two commonalities between these different styles of leadership. So firstly, leaders need to recognize the differences and the values of their followers, and then they need to look beyond their own personal needs to enhance their experience and the needs of their followers. So that said, if millennials have been described as lazy and self-absorbed, how can they possibly achieve this? So as it turns out, millennials really are not all that bad. Millennials have been described as a socially minded generational cohort, and this can be used to their advantage when identifying the needs of their followers, in that they can recognize how the values of others around them can be useful in gaining a unique perspective when looking at perhaps organizational change or strategic planning. They recognize the advantage of having more than one viewpoint within their organization. Millennials should give and call attention to the specific needs of their followers in relation to the various attributes that may be associated to their generational cohort. So baby boomers, for example, are described as a cohort that respect authority within the workplace. Millennial leaders need to develop this authority by giving personal and positive attention to their baby boomer followers, be transparent in their interactions, offer genuine solutions to problems, not develop temporary ones that are ill-conceived or a quick fix. Members of Generation X are said to value a work-life balance. So millennial leaders need to develop trust amongst this cohort by understanding why that work-life balance is important to them. Is it because they saw their parents working very hard and came home to an empty home? Is that why understanding really the root of why they have these values is important in developing that trust. So when millennial leaders take a genuine interest in the unique needs of their followers, a mutually beneficial relationship can be developed within an organization. So why does this matter? How does this affect the work that we're doing in our professional world? So personally, in my career, I have often found myself to be the youngest member of many of the teams that I work on, and I'm thrown into a position where I need to be working with individuals who may have been at an organization for a very long time and have the mentality of this is the way it's always been done. And that's really challenging to work through as well. So I know, and I take into account the fact that I need to be mindful and respectful of these individuals and their experiences. I recognize that the need to be transparent, flexible, and attentive to the needs and the values of those around me is critical to impart not only change, but successful change, and ultimately develop trust amongst my colleagues. Another wrench being thrown into the mix is that while baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials are certainly making up the majority of workplaces right now, as I mentioned, we now have Generation Z to contend with, and they come with a vastly different set of values and perspectives that we may have not been accustomed to in the workplace before. So with every generation within the workplace, utilizing the key components of follower-centric leadership can assist in the development of positive relationships. At the end of the day, listening and recognizing that the needs of one will not be the same as the needs of all will allow leaders to be more aware of who they're working with within their organization. And while the attributes of these generational cohorts can be found to be generalizations, the socio-historical moments of life that these individuals have experienced certainly form who they come to be, particularly in the workplace. So transformational, authentic, and servant leadership are ultimately styles of leadership that demand leaders to look outside of their own interests and look towards better serving those around them. And no matter the industry, age cohort, life experiences we have, we could all use a little more selflessness in the world today. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for everybody's time and attention. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Marina.
Yeah, thank you, Lane.
Do we have any questions or thoughts to share? I actually have a question for you. As all of this research you did on being a leader for multi-generational organizations, curious how this has impacted or maybe reframed your role as a follower within your organization.
That's a great question. I think that I have learned to not make assumptions about what people's level of comfort is with certain aspects within the workplace, like specifically related perhaps to technology. I tend to, and maybe it's because I see my parents, and I lump most people their age into the same category. And so I make an assumption about maybe the strengths that a colleague may have with regards to technology, and that I should just be the one to pick that up because I'm a millennial and I'm more tech savvy, and that's unfair. So I think certainly if I have a manager or a leader who is older than me or in a position where they've been in a role longer, I have to be a little mindful of the conclusions that I jump to before giving them a fair shot, just based on my own preconceived notions.
Yeah, thanks. It sounds like a lot of what you're sharing, there's a lot of self-reflection involved.
Hugely. Yeah. This was a topic that was very close to me. It's something that I experienced, and it was a lot of learning about myself and who I am as well.
So we have a question from Dan asking, what leadership style or styles do you find you use most often at your institution, and with which stakeholders?
Definitely. So the greatest part of the program that we did at Guelph was we had to take time to learn about our own personal leadership styles. And I mean, at my institution, it's hard to say. Full transparency, I work for an American university and I work remotely up in Toronto. So it's hard to develop relationships cross-culturally. But my personal leadership style, I try to be as authentic as possible. I really believe that authentic leadership is such a powerful and positive style to employ with the different people that I work with, even if they're not people who directly report to me. I think just coming in with a attitude of, I'm going to take this relationship with as much positive energy as possible, I think is a really valuable tool. With stakeholders, I would say, because I'm working enrollment management, it's certainly more servant leadership. What can I do for the customer, if you will, that I work with? What can I do for them to enhance their experience as they go through the motions of being in the enrollment management world?
Thanks. We have one more question from Nicole. Any advice on how to approach a situation where you have a multi-generational team and the needs of one generation directly conflict with the other? How do you help your followers understand the other generations?
It's a great question. So I think having come from working on a team where there was like baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials all in the team, everybody had different levels of comfortability when it came to certain aspects of communicating, project management, how they got their work done. Some people really love flex hours. Some people liked a traditional 9 to 5. So I think it's coming in with, where do you see your strengths and where do you see your areas of weakness, and how can somebody pick up where somebody else needs to put down? I think that that's really important. I think one of the most interesting things I learned from my research was that these generational cohorts as a whole, theorists are starting to move away from them because people do tend to put people in boxes. I mean, that certainly is true, but I also think that the way that people grew up and the experiences they had as a generational cohort impact the way that they show up in their workplace. So I think just sharing a little bit about how you got to where you were based on your previous experiences or what you saw happening in the world around you. A lot of open communication. I think we like I fully admitted, we tend to make a lot of assumptions about what people can or can't do. And I think that once we let go of that, we have the ability to be a little bit more collaborative and cohesive.
Thanks so much, Marina.
Thank you.
We have a comment from Sarah. Well done. Love that you bring followership into the mix. We often miss the boat on that important area of team development, which I think is a really, really great reflection.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, so I think we'll take a quick 5-minute break just to allow everybody to stretch, and then we will come back at about 2:50 Eastern time. So 5 to 6 minutes, depending on your time zone. And then we will have Dan, Logan, and Nicole presenting. So thanks, everyone. Okay, so next up we have Dan Cantiller, and his presentation is titled Trauma and Student Learning in the Post-Pandemic Academy.
All right, so hopefully folks can see the screen. Okay, so we'll get started. So thanks so much. Very happy to be part of this graduate research forum hosted by the Graduate Student Network through Caucus. So thank you all for being here today, and for anyone who's joining and listening to the recording after. So yes, as Lee mentioned, my presentation is called Trauma and Student Learning in the Post-Pandemic Academy. First, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. So I am joining today in Toronto, which is in Treaty 13 territory, covered with the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement with the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to protect the land. This is also the homeland of the Chippewa and the Wendat. I acknowledge my responsibility as an immigrant and settler to this space to honor the rich histories and resilience of Indigenous peoples, as well as the diversity of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people that now have Toronto as their home. And you may have noticed, I guess, from my title slide that I'm using X University to represent my institution. The namesake for institution is widely recognized as a key architect of the Indian residential school system. And this form of awareness raising and education is something that has been pushed forward, especially by our Indigenous students, faculty, and staff. And there have been a lot of developments and ongoing discussion at our institution, including the felling of the statue. But there is a presidential task force, the Standing Strong Task Force, that is still currently working to review and make recommendations about how our institution can move forward. All right, so a little bit about me. So hi, I was very tempted to wear this shirt today, but I did not. Yes, my name is Dan. My pronouns are he, him. My current role is as a decision support analyst in the Ted Rogers School of Management, Office of the Dean. And I just recently finished my Master of Education from Memorial University of Newfoundland in post-secondary studies. So this was a 3-year part-time, fully online program. And even though it was already fully online, definitely still gave me a run for my money towards the end because of COVID. So also congratulations to everyone who's kind of finished or finishing or is partway through their studies. And my professional experience is in student affairs. So I've worked at a couple institutions in functional areas that include housing, residence life, learning and transition support, and academic advising. So yeah, so moving on. So the title of my final paper for my program was called Trauma, Healing, and Learning in the Canadian Post-Secondary Institution. And I have hyperlinked it to, I have posted it on Medium, where you're welcome to read. It's also hyperlinked here, so I'm happy to share the slides following, so feel free to reach out to me. But basically, in a nutshell, these were the two kind of guiding questions that kind of informed what I wrote about. And so they are, first, are trauma-informed practices effective at improving student academic learning and engagement? And as well, how can these practices be incorporated into Canadian post-secondary learning environments? And I do want to offer or just include a brief content warning, just acknowledging that the topic that I'm discussing in this presentation and in the paper does include mentions of and discussion of trauma, and as well as intergenerational trauma, racism, grief, loss, and ableism. Sorry, not ableism, and abuse. Sorry, I'm having a bit of difficulty with my screen. So I want to encourage you and welcome you to kind of engage with this material as you feel comfortable. And if you're welcome to take a break or choose to come back for a later presentation in case that's how you feel equipped to. But I do want to be respectful of that due to the nature of the topic. All right, so what is trauma? So for the purposes of my writing and for my exploration, I really in particular liked this definition by Banyard and Cantiller. So it describes trauma as a range of events that overwhelm an individual's coping capacities and involves threats of serious injury or death to self or someone close to the individual. So this is very much in terms of how it's personally felt by the person, in terms of feeling a sense of overwhelm and a threat of danger to either, again, themselves or someone close to them. And by extension, trauma-informed practices are pedagogies and other approaches that we may have, for example, in our programming that recognize that trauma exists in the environment and that learners or other participants may be impacted by trauma. So looking at the themes from the literature, so I was mostly looking at how trauma in post-secondary was being discussed in the Canadian and American context mostly. But from a couple of really interesting studies and papers, I was able to see that discussion that trauma is quite prevalent in our institutional communities. So particularly with students, and there's a high prevalence of students, or number of students who are coming to our institutions that have already experienced some form of trauma or have that in their history. But then even more surprising through this study by Fraser and colleagues was that students are likely to experience some form of trauma while they're pursuing their studies. So that might be the loss of a loved one, that might be experiencing, assault, like a sexual assault or physical assault of some kind, or some other major life event that really challenges their ability to cope. And I think in light of this past year, we'd be hard pressed to find someone who wouldn't describe some kind of connection, either personally or within their close circle, that relates to trauma or has re-triggered an experience of trauma for them. Through the research as well, kind of looking into how trauma impacts people, and there are biological, physiological impacts that relate to our own kind of stress responses, and how that can be exhibited in anxiety or panic or nightmares. But also as thinking about how students and how learning is impacted, trauma does have an impact on individuals' memory, perceptions, and reactions. So if you are touched by or re-triggered by trauma, then it might be very distracting, or that you might perceive interactions or discussions. It might be that are happening in class or in an online forum, for example. There might be assumptions that are lit for you in terms of how people are treating a topic of discussion with respect or a lack of respect, and that can really impact your ability to kind of proceed. It might interrupt your ability to participate. And other things that came across is that, and as I think has become familiar in our practice and in research, this idea of intergenerational trauma, particularly with regards to Indigenous learners and Indigenous communities, across our country, especially with recent discoveries at former residential school sites, right? And even inquiries and reports into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So this is something that's very real for members of our community, and as well thinking about sort of the landscape of post-secondary education in Canada, and recognizing this is a growing population of learners that we want to be better able to support. So I think this is also very important for us to understand. Something that really came across in terms of this discussion of what is our duty as educators, as student affairs and services professionals, was this idea of focusing more relational approaches with our students, and trying to also support faculty in exploring different ways of teaching or facilitating learning environments that stress relationships of trust and support with students, which can be very challenging when you have a multi-hundred first year course, especially in this past year when it's all been online. So imagine that experience for students. And when I have presented this content to our learning and teaching conference at my institution, that was a question of how can I, as an instructor, with best intentions, how can I actually try to build more of a relational approach or environment that also respects my own knowledge or maybe gaps in knowledge, or how do I better connect them with services? And I'll talk a little bit about that very briefly after. But connected with this relational pedagogy is the idea that through how we interact with students and how we support peer supports among students, these can actually serve as protective factors of how to kind of build resilience or a network of support for people who are experiencing or re-experiencing trauma. So in my writing of this paper, these were some populations in particular that I wanted to highlight in terms of who may be impacted by trauma, but as well who could benefit from trauma-informed support and pedagogy. So as I mentioned before, Indigenous learners, but also Black and racialized students, as you can imagine in many of the events this past year, but as well survivors of abuse, and those who are managing grief and loss. So I'm going to first talk about some strategies or like related to practices for instructors or for faculty, and then I'll also mention a little bit about student affairs practice. So with instructors, again, when I mentioned the relational pedagogy, really having that goal of fostering trusting and personal relationships with students. The students aren't just numbers. There's an effort to actually like build a relationship or awareness of the student experience. As instructors or people who hold power in those spaces, it's really important to acknowledge like your responsibility to kind of create a safer environment. So we can't fully protect students from what's happening in the world, nor should we ignore that. But we should do our best and our due diligence to not expose them to unnecessary harm, right? So, and the best way that I've had this described to me was that as an educator, put yourself in the shoes of the student, right? And take a look at your content and your approaches. Is there anything that would cause harm that you're not aware of, right? Or that you haven't considered, maybe because it's your specialty, like maybe your jam and like your life's work has been talking about grief and loss, but how would that impact a student who's trying to engage with this material? So trying to look at it from fresh eyes. And so beyond, of course, like trying to maintain, decorum or like respect in the environment so that there's hopefully nothing like physically violent, thinking about as well about the emotional and psychological well-being of your students. And that's why I think this article by Eisen, which I have in my references, I think was very helpful in terms of trying to offer some language around support for trigger warnings or content warnings, where some people dismiss that as sometimes maybe babying or like, why do we have to do this? Like, they're adults, they can deal with this, like nothing's going to protect them in the real world kind of thing. Maybe yes, but like there is a real benefit to giving people a heads up, especially because of how it can impact people, especially if they're caught off guard. Additionally, I think it's really important in terms of fostering that safety or safer environment in the classroom or in the online forum is addressing disruption. So there's a whole role modeling piece here. If there's really inappropriate jokes or comments that are made in class or on discussion boards, and if they're not addressed at all or not addressed appropriately, then it kind of condones that behavior to continue, right? And a student, because we never necessarily always know who's in our environments or what they've experienced, but if they see that that's acceptable, for those jokes to be made, then they could feel very singled out or unsafe, or they may question or lack trust then in the instructor who should step in some form, even if they can't do it in the moment, even coming back the following week saying like, I want to address, a line of discussion that we had last week. And I thought about it, here's why this might not be appropriate, that was not appropriate for our class, right? And here's where you can, learn more about this, or like, let's revisit this, right? So even taking the time to do that. I think like where trauma-informed practice might make some instructors uncomfortable is that it might be seen as something that's too personable or personal, where they want to be a bit more objective, right? And also, recognizing that faculty, instructors are also impacted by trauma, right? Or have experienced the past year. So there's a level of comfort in terms of like how much are you willing to invest in those personal relationships with students. And as I mentioned before about class size or different things like that, like there is a certain thing around like how much training that instructors would need to be able to understand trauma-informed care or practices, as well as, if we're asking an instructor to lecture to 500 students, right? Like how can they effectively kind of manage that space, right? Especially if there are disruptions. So those are some questions to kind of like think about. In terms of student affairs support, so I think going back to that study by Fraser saying that, hey, a lot of students are coming to our institutions having experienced trauma, or they will experience trauma. This is something that we should pay more attention to, in the sense of, if we're looking at a strategy or a committee about student health and wellness, We can ask questions about students' experiences that they're coming to our institution with, as well as understanding their journey throughout their 4, 5, or 6 years with us, or 2 or 3 if they're at a college, for example, and kind of understanding what actual examples of trauma do students experience while they're with us, or what are they coming to us with, so that we can better inform what supports can look like. Or, as I mentioned, in terms of highlighting programming, if you anticipate what some of those experiences or needs might be, then you either have those as ongoing available, like drop-in supports, like so things around sexual violence and assault, or but also in terms of grief support, that those are regular things and not just thrown together if there's a major world event, right? I think this idea as well for any of our programs, or even, sometimes we're critical of students who sign up for something but then, don't show up. And that can be frustrating as a programmer, or as someone who provides a service. But I think also recognizing that, especially in this past year, you want to be supportive. People make the right decisions for them, and they may or may not disclose the reasons why they're participating or not participating in a certain way. So I think kind of being mindful of that as well, and not pushing as hard on people, and giving them the space to make the right choice for them. I liked these principles that Corello and Butler kind of offered in terms of what are principles for trauma-informed practices, or TIP, and they underline safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. So really with these ideas of being more informed and trying to be more mindful of the needs of the individual, we're trying to empower them to choose how they're going to engage, right? Or choose how they're going to show up. Or what they need for themselves, and helping them self-advocate, but also being experts in terms of what's available on our campuses so we can better refer them. And I'm almost done. So imagining the post-pandemic future. So I really like that title, and I guess I just like creating a punchy title. But I think, this has been really timely, right? I think through the research that I was able to review, there isn't actually a whole lot of Canadian specific research. So this is an area that we can kind of continue to learn more about. I think there's more discussion that I was able to find about this sort of stateside, but sort of the experience of trauma may look different, or be more nuanced in certain ways, like here in the Canadian context of post-secondary. More systematic assessment. So as I mentioned, maybe rolling out and asking questions related to trauma and support for trauma experiences for students who are incoming, but as well as they kind of move through their programs or their time with us. And then I think for us all to be very mindful about, what have the impacts been during COVID and this pandemic, right? People have lost opportunities. People's plans have totally changed. So I think especially as some of us are moving back to on campus, I think that's something that we can't ignore. And I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's a really important, exclamation point of, we should pay attention to this. And I think that there is space for us to better understand the experiences of racialized students, right, in other equity deserving groups, and also think about, the future of what higher education student affairs might look like when we have more people who are maybe displaced due to different, world events. And so I think that there's different ways that we can kind of look at this. So my closing thoughts. So we can't afford to disregard the presence or impact of trauma in our communities. We have to be really deliberate. We have to be really deliberate about practicing how students might be acknowledged, right? And make efforts to not exacerbate that experience, or that we're prepared to support them. And in whatever way that we can, or whatever way we can support students and faculty who work with students, fostering supportive relationships so that they can be able to progress towards success, whatever that looks like for them. And those are some references to do. And yeah, that's my contact. So my email is dancan@ryerson.ca. Twitter is dancan_thinks. And I'm happy to share this slide deck, or have further conversations if you're interested. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Dan. I really appreciate your thoughtful approach to that presentation and some of your insights and reflections. I think just for timing, I think we'll move on to the next presentation, but if you have questions for Dan, please feel free to put them into the chat. Dan, if you don't mind just keeping an eye out there for any questions. And then next up, we have Logan Lorenz, who is presenting on indigenization of student affairs and services.
Thank you. My name's Logan. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm in the No PowerPoint Club as well. So Noah and I are together on that. Just want to take a moment. I am joining you from downtown Vancouver. We are currently in the middle of a heat wave, but I'm also, more importantly than that, joining you from the land of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Stolo. They've been on this land for many years, many more years than I've been on it. A little bit about who I am. I've been working in the field of student affairs and services for about 7 years, mainly in the areas of international education. So working with international students, study abroad. I've also been working in student life and orientation. And most recently, I am working in the area of career development, which I've been doing for about the last 3 years. I recently completed my master's degree. So I did a Master of Arts in Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia. And I'm currently employed at the UBC Sauder School of Business as a career manager, where I help students who are doing non-business degrees and capping it with a master's degree in business to think about what a career might look like for them. A little bit about my topic. So my topic today is on the indigenization of student affairs and services in Canadian higher education, which is also, which is what I did my master's thesis on. I, want to take a moment and acknowledge that I'm, very privileged to be educated, white, cisgender, male. I've had a lot of privileges throughout my life and continue to. I also want to kind of set the context by acknowledging that Indigenous peoples have generally had negative experiences of or with higher education in Canada. These include things like enfranchisement, where they would have at one point lost their status and some associated, I guess, rights, where however you look at those, good or bad, it does affect, or did at one point affect that. As well, some of that has contributed, other pieces, residential schools, et cetera, have contributed to not generally great experiences in higher education systems in Canada. When I started working in student affairs and services, I started to notice or to kind of have some indirect experiences around indigenization. So I started seeing things like commitments from institutions or governments or professional organizations like Caucus towards things like indigenization or decolonization. I started to see it in some of my work, where at one point I was asked to start thinking about how to indigenize study abroad, for example. And through these, I started to realize my own gaps in my knowledge and experience. I started to really take a moment to reflect on what I knew growing up or what I learned in school or in university. And to be honest, I kind of realized I didn't know very much. And I am from Alberta, but I've been in Vancouver for about the past 7 years. And I started to realize I didn't know much about Indigenous peoples here in Vancouver or in BC. At the same time, while I kind of acknowledge that Indigenous peoples maybe have had mixed experiences with higher education, higher education in BC and Canada continues to grow and diversify, both in the number of students, the number of institutions, the type of programs, as well as the type of students, including Indigenous students. Indigenous students do still, I guess, kind of fall behind a little bit in terms of completion of high school, which also affects their, completion of post-secondary and or the types of programs they may be engaged with in higher education. But, there is generally a movement towards helping support Indigenous people better in higher education. So my topic, as I mentioned, is on indigenization. Essentially, I had 3 research questions. My research questions were largely around how do student affairs professionals make sense of indigenization? What are they doing about it? And where are they learning, or where are they filling in gaps of knowledge? My research study was done at a research university in British Columbia. Or my research site was a university here in BC. I completed 12 semi-structured interviews with folks that more or less fall into the categories of student affairs and services professionals. These people were mainly female and mainly non-Indigenous. They did represent a wide variety of services, with 11 of 12 being distinct services from each other. Some of the key takeaways from my project, I'm going to kind of explain this by research questions. So my first research question, I guess to kind of go in a bit more detail, was how do student affairs and services professionals make sense of ongoing efforts to indigenize student affairs and higher education in Canada? The information I got from my participants was that they saw this as being one of two main ways. So understanding Indigenous knowledges. So most participants understood that Indigenous knowledge and kind of how you define Indigenous knowledge, but also what that means, and particularly in a local context, was important as a basis for indigenization. It would be difficult to move forward with any kind of indigenizing activities if you didn't have a base knowledge of what it means in your area. The other piece about making sense of efforts to indigenize was really taking time to think both on an individual and a group level why indigenization was important. Largely, they felt that it could be helpful, obviously, to Indigenous students, and it could also be helpful to all students on campus. And even participants from departments that maybe didn't directly support Indigenous students, or maybe identified that they didn't support many Indigenous students just in the nature of their work, also felt that there were meaningful applications of indigenization. My second research question was, how are some Canadian student affairs and services professionals indigenizing the work they do, the departments they work in, and the campuses that they work on? These fell into three main categories. So some of these activities, not very exciting categories, but were on-campus activities, off-campus activities, and university-wide initiatives. So in terms of on-campus activities, these were activities that were specifically created on campus for on-campus community members, particularly students. Off-campus activities were activities that were meant to either bring the university out into local Indigenous communities or bring the Indigenous communities into the university. And then lastly, university-wide initiatives. So in this particular campus, that largely looked like it was, to be honest, a fair bit of kind of visibly indigenizing. So they had bilingual street signs, they displayed different types of Indigenous art or artifacts. And it also was things like a specific admissions program for Indigenous students at the institution. And participants also kind of related to that research question identified that they felt that the university-wide initiatives were important to show that the institution was moving forward as a whole, and that indigenization meant something together. My third research question was, in what ways do some student affairs and services professionals engage in unlearning and relearning of colonial histories in Canada? There were four main ways that folks identified kind of doing this, or I guess how I grouped it. One was engagement with the Department of Indigenous Student Services. So many institutions obviously have a specific department that supports Indigenous learners. This can look differently based on institutions or campuses, but this was definitely identified as the strongest resource. So although it's a resource that's useful or is designed to be helping Indigenous students specifically or supporting them directly, many staff members felt that this was a very good resource for themselves and for them to learn. Other ones that came up, independent learning experiences. So this looked quite different based on participant, but this could be things like reading, this could be enrolling in MOOC courses, this could be meeting with or learning from Indigenous people, but definitely was kind of a one-on-one on your own sort of activity. There were some campus-based learning experiences as well. So generally these look like opportunities where the campus created opportunities for learning together. Some of this occurred maybe within departments, others like in the division of student affairs at the institution, and others were kind of more university-wide, open to people across the institution. And then lastly was kind of learning from Indigenous peoples directly. So this kind of manifested itself in a couple different ways. Some of this was actually maybe trying to learn if there was a openness to learn from Indigenous students. Some people identified that they grew up in communities that had larger Indigenous populations, so they had friendships and built relationships over many years. And yeah, so on this piece, I guess the big thing is that most of the participants did actively engage in some form of unlearning and relearning activities. So they did feel like they needed to, that their knowledge was incomplete or incorrect, and that there was something they could do about it, and they were doing something about it. And then kind of on this piece around, I guess, sort of relating back to Indigenous knowledge, there was an identification that it was important for them to learn maybe principles that are common for many Indigenous peoples, as well as develop a localized Indigenous knowledge. So if one were to, for example, only engage in the first of those two, kind of common for many Indigenous peoples, the criticism often is a pan-Indigenous knowledge base comes out. So it's important maybe to know two of these things. So one that might be more common would be something like a relational approach to knowledge or learning. Some of the things that I think are significant or where my study could be applied, I do think this is probably of interest to folks, obviously maybe on the call, but also in the larger student affairs and services world and higher education. It definitely, I think that there is sometimes a lack of research in student affairs and services, and there's now especially actually quite a growing a canon of knowledge on student affairs in Canada, as well as indigenization. So I think this contributes there as well. And just trying to think what else I want to say. I think, maybe the last piece I'll kind of close with is around future research. So I did this research in 2019. So even within the 2 years, I guess there was, a pre-pandemic world and now an almost post-pandemic world, or this pandemic world. So lots has probably changed within that 2 years as well. So it does represent a specific moment in time, and I think even people on the call probably, and I can include myself in this, think differently about indigenization than maybe I would have in 2019, or my participants would have in 2019. Another kind of area of future research, I zoomed in on student affairs and services professionals, but obviously there are other experiences happening in higher education. So other members of the institution, like students or faculty or leadership, community members maybe that engage with institutions. And then also, my study was done at an institution here in British Columbia, but this could look pretty different even at different institutions in different provinces or even outside of Canada. And then lastly, I think really examining the role of decolonization. I think that this is a piece maybe in my study that I could have done a lot stronger, was thinking about decolonization. I really zoomed in on indigenization, but I think indigenization plus decolonization is really maybe something that should be explored. So I'm just going to pop a couple links into the chat. So one is my LinkedIn profile. I do work in career education, so I'm a LinkedIner, but I also have added the link to my thesis. I don't necessarily recommend you read it. However, I'm going to put it there in case you maybe want to check the references to see some interesting articles that you could read. And on that note, I think I am done on time.
Thanks so much, Logan. I really appreciated your reflections, especially that piece on, thinking about what has changed from 2019 to today, and what that could mean for future areas of research. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Logan? Doesn't look like it.
Wow, I guess my rushed preparation really paid off there. So thanks so much for listening, everyone, and look forward to connecting.
Thanks, Logan. Okay, so last up we have Nicole on designing effective online orientation programs for first-year university students.
Screen sharing always takes a moment. Are we good?
Yep,
No, you're
can
looking at the wrong screen, aren't you?
Yeah, we can see the side. It's not.
You try again. No matter how many times I do this. All right, you might see yourself for a minute.
There we
Now
go.
can you see it?
Yep.
Great. 60 days, like 60 million years later, I figured it out. Thank you all for sticking around this long in this event to talk about what I think is a somewhat drastically different topic than the others, designing effective online orientation programs for first-year students. So my name is Nicole Crozier. I recently completed my Master's of Education in Educational Technology at the University of Victoria. I have also been a staff member at the University of Victoria in the Office of Student Life for the last 3.5 years. I work as the coordinator of curriculum and communications, which means I oversee a lot of our communications initiatives, primarily focused on our incoming students. And I also see our online orientation program that we call the pre-arrival program. So these two things came together really well for me, studying educational technology while designing online learning. So I spent a large portion of my degree investigating the question, how do we create effective and engaging self-paced asynchronous online orientation programs? So I do want to emphasize that when I am talking about online orientation, I am talking about self-paced asynchronous programs. I know in the last year, online orientation has been the only orientation, so the definition has sort of grown, but sort of that online course that's self-paced and asynchronous that students can do before they arrive. So my graduate program was project-based, not thesis-based. So at the end of the day, all of this research ended up being put together in a website called Taking Orientation Online. You can find it at onlineotr.ca. The website contains both a replication of the University of Victoria's pre-arrival program, as well as probably 20 to 25 different blog posts that explore different aspects of creating a program. There's a lot of information on the site that I encourage you to go explore. I will not be able to tell you all of the things here today, but I will walk you through sort of the framework that I worked on or that I've developed or adopted that I think is super helpful for people who are either beginning this project or have it underway already. So I never thought I would be a person who is obsessed with a framework or a model, but throughout my research and my work, I have found that the community of inquiry model really works well in helping to design an online orientation program. So this is really a theoretical framework that has been built to help design deep and meaningful online learning experiences. It talks about sort of your online experience has to have 3 different presences: teaching presence, cognitive presence, and social presence. All of these in the literature have sort of specific definitions and specific facets. Some of them apply to online orientation in this asynchronous self-paced context. Some of them I kind of needed to throw out. So I love the model. I have adapted it a little bit for online orientation. So I'll walk you through each of the 3 presences, what they mean in the model, how I've adopted them, and then a few tips for designing a program under each of those areas. So the first presence is teaching presence. By definition, this is the design, facilitation, and direction of cognitive and social processes for the purpose of realizing learning outcomes. That sounds very academic-y, or in grad school. What this really means is that it looks at the design and organization of a course platform, it looks at the creation of learning activities, and it looks at communication with learners. Some of those things are still relevant, some of them not so much. So when I looked at teaching presence from the lens of designing an online orientation, teaching presence is really that invisible hand that guides students through the course and facilitates their learning. There's rarely an actual person who is present in the course teaching. So really the way you structure your course and guide students through is that teacher. What that means in practice is that the usability of your course is incredibly important. If a learner can easily complete the tasks, and I say easily from a navigation use perspective, not from a learning perspective, but if a learner can complete the course, they'll be highly satisfied, they'll be more motivated, and they'll be more likely to actually complete it. Some of the things that sort of lend to higher usability, good user interface design. Again, your content and activities need to be easy to access. Students need to be able to find them in the system. They need to be able to navigate easily from one place to another. Information needs to be organized logically. And one of the things I found most interesting is that allowing users to have an overview of everything in the course, even subtopics, was really important for helping them navigate through. You want to mitigate tech problems as much as possible. Choose your tech tools wisely. Test everything in every format possible on different device types, different browsers, different operating systems. Some things work that you think they work, and then they don't when you open Safari. And make sure that access to help is clearly and easily available. Visual design is also important, so the look and feel of a course and course activities does matter. Our second presence is cognitive presence. So this is the exploration, construction, resolution, and confirmation of understanding. So really where that learning takes place. What's involved in creating cognitive presence is choosing appropriate learning activities, designing those learning activities effectively, and providing feedback. So again, this presence really focuses on the creation of learning activities, or I've really focused it on the creation of learning activities. And really kind of asking the question is, how do you create intellectual and mental effort into that learning? How do you design your activities so students aren't just passively consuming content, but are actually engaged in your learning? One of, I think, the most important things to do when thinking about what activities you want to design is really think about your pedagogy. It's easy in an online world to get distracted by or excited by, ooh, this activity type looks fun. Ooh, look, we can make flashcards and a matching game. But if the flashcards and matching games don't match the pedagogy that will help students learn, they're not actually that useful. Depending on the medium you choose, so text, video, interactive activity, there are many design considerations for each of those mediums. Again, can't go into here, but they're on the website. And then you also want to give good feedback often so that students know they're on the right track. The last presence is social presence. So this is the ability of participants to project their personal characteristics into the learning community, thereby presenting themselves as real people. So this is largely and often done by creating peer-to-peer connections. And this might be through discussion boards, group projects, peer review, things like that. The interesting thing about this presence in the context of online orientation is that discussion boards, group projects, and peer review don't really work. Because it's self-paced, because it's a short course, you can't have group projects and peer review. Students just won't come together in that way. And even discussion boards, because a student typically goes through once, they're not going back in and looking again, don't really work to help connect students. So I have sort of shifted social presence towards the idea of community building. So instead of trying to create a community within your course, shift it towards welcoming students to a community within the institution, which is ultimately your long-term goal anyway. how do you do this? I think we sometimes, when we have our in-person orientation programs, we know the value of our orientation leaders. We know the value of that peer-to-peer sharing from current students. And that equally applies in an online orientation program. As much as possible, you want to share the personal stories and experiences of your current students. You can do this through video, through student profiles, through quotes, whatever methods you can, insert the voices of your current students. You can potentially also find ways to make the instructor more visible in this course. They might be present in videos. You might have the same person sort of in a quote bubble providing instructions throughout. Again, building that connection to somebody to help build their community. So quick summary, how do you create effective and engaging self-paced asynchronous online orientation programs? There are a million small things you can do to improve your program, but at a high level, it's about ensuring a high ease of use, building interactive and active learning content, incorporating student voices, motivate, motivate, motivate. Didn't talk about this piece in this presentation, but motivation to get students through the end is key. And you really want to be intentional about absolutely everything that you are putting into your program and every decision you're making. Again, if you want to learn more about designing an effective online orientation program, similar to Logan, I have an entire thesis that I wouldn't really recommend you read. I also have a published paper. It's better, but it's still 7,000 words. But the website onlineotr.ca is the best place to find bite-sized content that can help you along the way.
Thanks so much, Nicole. We have a question in the chat from Norma. I'm wondering if you can speak to the assessment process. Speak to the assessment process to assess the effectiveness of the online orientation program.
Yeah, I won't say there's lots of research about online orientation because that's false, but some of the research from other institutions has shown that their program has sort of made students feel more confident, more prepared. Some have shown GPA changes, some have not. I also think that's dependent on what content you're putting in and the quality of your program and a variety of factors. For the program that we do at UVic, we have a pre-post test in our program. So we ask students to rate at the beginning, how confident do they feel essentially in each of the topic areas. And then at the end, they sort of re-rate their confidence in those levels. We do see a shift in how confident they are to do academic things, to maintain health and wellness, things like that. Not to promote my website, the website again, but there is a full post on assessment that walks you through some different strategies that you can use to assess sort of in different ways. We also assess like completion is also a metric for us. If they're not even doing the program, it's obviously not helpful.
Thanks, Nicole. Just a few comments. This is so relevant with some really practical applications. Thank you for sharing. And then Norma says she'll check out that your website there. I'm curious to your last point about being intentional about everything you include. Can you maybe share a little bit about how you chose what was there and what the process was like to, I guess, did you feel like you had to narrow the scope to expand it? How did you kind of get to the place where you felt like every piece the students were interacting with was intentional and meaningful?
Yeah, I have come to believe that the number one thing you can do as a student affairs professional is be intentional about your work, and that will make your work far better than like not being intentional. We had a pretty standardized design process for creating sort of the activities and the content in our modules. We basically sat down with a group of people who knew the topic area really well, brainstormed everything a student might need to know, learn, do, whatever it might be, categorized those, took that to develop our learning outcomes. And then in our program, it's basically one activity focuses on each learning outcome. And I think that process for us has really allowed us to say, this is what we decided we wanted to do. As a group, you all agreed, these were our learning outcomes. Each of these activities meets that learning outcome. So it kind of prevents other people from coming in being like, but also this, and also this, and also this. For anyone who works in orientation, you're familiar with like everyone wants access to your students to share their message, but really coming up with those key things together made it easy for us to say, like, you agreed to this, so you can't now want something else.
That's great, thank you. Do we have any other questions for Nicole? We also still have Dan and Marina with us if there are any other questions from their presentations. Give it another. Nicole, your website is awesome. It is. I've spent quite a bit of time going through it. Okay, well, I think we will wrap things up then. I really just want to say thank you again to all of our presenters. Thank you to everybody for logging in today. I love this. This was great. I hope this is something that can happen every year because I think when Nicole and I were chatting about this, we really wanted to create a platform for sharing a lot of the wonderful grad work that folks are doing in student affairs. So I wish everyone a lovely summer, wherever that takes you, maybe a little farther than your backyard now that things are slowly starting to reopen, and just wish you all well. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.